How much will it cost the Jets to trade for Aaron Rodgers? Can the team afford an expensive veteran quarterback and Quinnen Williams? How far away are the Jets from contending? We'll talk about all this and more on today's Mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, February 22nd, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. And today our episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Well, we approach the offseason. The official beginning of the offseason is just a few weeks away, and we have our weekly mailbag show today. Each Wednesday, we try to do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. I'll get to as many of them as I can today. We begin with a question about Aaron Rodgers. I'm not sure I understand why the Jets would have to give up anywhere near a first-round pick, let alone 2 for Rodgers. If Rodgers emerges from the darkness and decides that he wants out of Green Bay and that he wants to come to the Jets, what leverage does Green Bay have? There are multiple reports that they are ready to move on. Their only leverage is to decide to not trade him or trade him somewhere that he doesn't want to go. Neither one of those things is a real option. Do you think a third-round pick gets it done? Well, I think it's a good question. And I think that you've laid out a scenario where the Jets would probably not have to give up a ton. And I do think in that scenario, we could be talking potentially about a third-round pick. But that's contingent on Rodgers, emerging from the darkness, as you so eloquently put it, and saying, I only want to play for the Jets. Through the whole Derek Carr saga, the question over the last few weeks before he was cut was, would he accept a trade? And a lot of people pointed out that Carr had a no-trade clause. Rodgers does not technically have a no-trade clause, but he doesn't really need one because at this point of his career, he can pretty much dictate where he wants to go, simply from the standpoint that if he doesn't want to go somewhere, he can threaten to retire. And there's nothing that team would be able to do. So Rodgers may not technically have a no-trade clause, but he can pretty much decide where he wants to play. But a lot of this depends on where he actually wants to go. And I go back, it's 15 years now. It's tough to believe it was 15 years ago that the Jets traded for Brett Favre. And in reality, the similarities, they're actually, I think you could argue there are as many differences as there are similarities between the Favre situation and the Rodgers situation. And part of it is that Favre retired, and then he came back in the summer, and Green Bay just was tired of it because it was actually, in some ways it was similar to this. So there are similarities as well, as much as I say there are differences. But it became like in every offseason there was drama, and it got to a point where Green Bay just said, we're moving on, we're going with Aaron Rodgers back in 2008. And Favre was like desperate to get to either Chicago or Minnesota at the time because he wanted to make the Packers pay. He wanted to go to a division rival and beat the Packers. And what happened is, and this was actually detailed in a book written by Peter King, the former writer for Sports Illustrated, who now has worked with NBC for a number of years. He detailed that Mike Tannenbaum actually texted Favre. I think he got the number from Peter King, actually, as the book tells the story. And he essentially talked Favre into coming to the Jets because it was a similar situation where, and I don't think Favre's heart was ever really in coming to the Jets, but the Jets essentially had to talk Favre into it because if Favre didn't want to play for you, he could just retire again. So it's difficult to gauge where Rodgers is at. I mean, I don't even know if Rodgers knows what he's going to do from one minute to the next. I don't think you can really get a good read on what direction he's going to want to move this thing because it's possible he comes out of the darkness and decides, you know what, I'm going to stick with Green Bay for another year. And there are all sorts of conflicting reports about this. And as best as I can tell, I mean, there have been some reports that Packers want to move on. There have been some reports that they'd be willing to have him back if he's fully committed. And as best as I can piece together things, I think about how he's missed the offseason program the last couple of years. I think about the year he had last year, these reports that maybe Green Bay's ready to move on. Maybe they're willing to accept him if he's committed. And you get the sense, and this is just a guess, but you get the sense that maybe Green Bay feels that Rodgers was not all in last year. Maybe he did not put in the work in the offseason to fully prepare. You wonder about his conditioning. So I think that, and I think, going off on a little side note here, I think that that's also a big question with Rodgers is how much of a commitment are you going to get him if you get him? If the Jets trade for him, will they get Aaron Rodgers who's really focused and rededicated because now he's got a new team and he's ready to prove the world wrong? Or are you going to get the Rodgers you had last year? So there's a lot out there. We don't know what's going to happen. Rodgers may say, I want to come back to Green Bay. It's also possible that he may say, there are a couple of teams I'd be interested in going to. Now, I've talked extensively about this contract, and just as a short recap, if you haven't heard those shows, Rodgers' salary for this year is $60 million. Now, the way it works, though, is that the cap hit will only be $15 million. The other $45 million will be on his team's cap balance sheet in future seasons. That's if the Jets, if he's traded. But it's still $60 million. Whether you pay the full 60 this year or whether it gets kicked to the future, it's very expensive. And that, I think, makes Rodgers less valuable. Because if you have to pay him that much money, he's the most expensive quarterback in the NFL. I do think it's worth asking, is this guy really somebody you have to pay a one for? Is he really somebody you have to pay multiple first-round picks for? And I think it's fair to say maybe not. But a lot of this comes down to a question because it's also possible Rodgers comes out and says, you know what, there are a couple different teams I'd be interested in. I'd be good going to any one of these teams. And in that case, then you get into a bidding war with other teams. So it really depends on Rodgers. It depends on whatever he's learning from this retreat he's at. And it'll depend on whether he dictates. He just says, this is the only team I'm willing to play for. In that case, if it's the Jets, they'd have a lot of leverage. If it's not, then it would be tough to get him. Although it's possible because the scenario I laid out with Tannenbaum and Favre in 08, where Favre was not really interested in coming to the Jets and Tannenbaum kind of talked him into it. That could be in play as well. Or it could be a situation where he's interested in going to multiple teams, in which case a 3 might not be enough to get it done. So there's just not enough known out there. It depends. I think you've laid out the scenario where the Jets could get him for cheap draft pick wise. I still think that contract's an issue, though. I think I can't get past that contract. Something has to give with that contract if the Jets are going to get him. Now, if something gives with that contract, I think there's a price where Rodgers is probably worth the roll of the dice, but we got to work out that contract. I do think in this scenario, things might be trending toward a spot where maybe at least you don't have to give up a ton of draft picks, which I think would be at least a positive to a certain extent. Our next question, do you think Jeremy Ruckard can become an above-average tight end? He was essentially redshirted last year. Which current tight end would you have as the comp for him? I don't really love doing comps, so I went back and looked at some of the draft scouting reports from last year because I think each player is individual, but I saw names not thrown out there like Dalton Schultz. I've seen Cameron Brate. So if you're looking for a comp, I'll leave that to the people who do the scouting reports because I always think each player is individual. And I get the utility of comps is that you can kind of imagine the style of a player, but it's always tough because you don't really know how a player is going to develop. So let's talk about how Ruckard's going to develop, even though you can't tell. I think it's possible. Listen, I was never expecting much from him last year. I felt like he was a project. And there's this one video of a great block he threw in the last game against Miami, going around on social media. Well, there are also some blocks he missed in that game. And, I think that that's actually kind of a microcosm of the player you were getting from Ohio State because a lot of people thought he was coming into the league as a great blocker because you saw some highlight reel blocks where he's, really aggressive. But I think there are also moments where he misses blocks because he plays a little out of control and maybe he doesn't channel that aggression well enough in the blocking game. So you see the highlight reels, but you also see if you watch more in depth that he's not that technically sound yet. He's got to learn to channel his aggression a little bit better. And I think he's still kind of a mystery in the receiving game because Ohio State had so much talent at the wide receiver position that Ruckard was not really featured. And I thought you saw kind of glimpses of his ability as a potential receiving threat if you watched enough of the film from Ohio State. But you have to remember, Ruckard's time at Ohio State, this is like the story that I tell that really tells the story of how much receiving talent Ohio State had when Ruckard was there. Jameson Williams, and you probably know this because Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson were there, both great players. We've seen Garrett Wilson firsthand, but the story I tell is Jameson Williams was on Ohio State's team and could not get on the field and had to transfer to Alabama. Jameson Williams found it was easier to get playing time at Alabama than it was Ohio State with those receivers. So I think there's untapped potential as a receiver. I don't think he's a guy. I think he's a guy who, can run decent routes potentially. He did not run a big route tree at Ohio State, but he impressed people last year in the process. He was a little bit more nuanced in his route running than people were expecting. A developmental player. And I think he could get better. This year was, as you said, it's a redshirt year. I was not expecting much from him. I think at the stage Ruckard was drafted, you got about a 1 in 5 shot from the numbers I've looked at of getting a player, which is not spectacular but not terrible. I think he can be. I think he can be a good player. I think this year's a big one though. I think for a player like Ruckard who came in as a total project, you want to see a big jump from year 1 to year 2. And the Jets could certainly use it at the tight end position because, as you may know, if you're a longtime listener, I'm not a big fan of Jets tight ends. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to continue our weekly mailbag. We're going to talk finances. We're going to talk salary cap. Can the Jets afford an expensive quarterback and retain Quinnen Williams? I think the answer is yes, and I'll explain why as we continue this Wednesday mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. The NFL season's over. We're talking offseason. We're talking about free agency. We're talking the draft. We're talking next year. But it's only the midway point of the NBA season. And it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers and threes drained. Now, once we get to the NFL season, you may be able to place a few bets on Jeremy Ruckard's production. So if you agree with me or disagree with me, you might be able to put some money on it. And FanDuel also lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. We continue with our weekly mailbag. Our next question, John, if the Jets sign Carr and extend Quinnen Williams, how much room would they realistically have for free agents? Both will require a lot of money, and I know the Jets can clear some cap space by cutting a few guys, but there are some intriguing free agents to target in Mike McGlinchey, Orlando Brown, etc. Is there even a remote chance the Jets can sign both Quinnen Williams and Carr and still sign some quality free agents? And if so, how? And the answer to that is yes. And I think the general question is, can the Jets really afford Quinnen Williams and Derek Carr? And the answer to that is yes. And the reason for that is the way the salary cap works. The way it works is essentially you don't necessarily get charged for the amount of money you pay a player in a certain year. So I can figure out a way where I can pay a player $15 million this year, and it only counts for $5 million against the salary cap. Now, that other $10 million does not go away. It's just you get charged it in future years. So there are ways to pretty easily manipulate the salary cap if you're tied up against it. There are teams you can see who've done this in recent years. The Saints are one, the Eagles are another. The Buccaneers have done this a lot, where they essentially manipulate the cap, where they pay a player a lot this year, but they aren't charged against the cap until future seasons. In fact, you see this a lot in first-year contracts. In a lot of contracts, the first year of it is the cap number is really low, and that's because the player receives a big signing bonus. And the cap hits for his signing bonus are spread out over a number of years. But the player receives the money practically up front. Usually the signing bonus is paid within a few weeks. So a player may get a $40 million signing bonus, and he gets $40 million up front, but you're only charged like $5 million. You can only be, sometimes if it's like a 5-year deal, you're only charged like $8 million because the cap charge is $8 million per year over 5 years, which gets you to $40 million. That's the $40 million signing bonus. And then what you can do is you can say to the player, well, hey, we just gave you $40 million. Can you take like a $1 million salary this year, base salary? Because that's what you get after playing the games. And that's different from the signing bonus. Signing bonus is what you get for signing the contract. Your salary is what you get for playing the games. So if I'm giving you a $40 million signing bonus, you got $40 million already. You could take a low salary this year, and that keeps your cap number low. So yes, it is possible. You can play around with the salary cap. I don't think that Quinnen Williams or Derek Carr is going to destroy the Jets salary cap situation. In fact, I'll say this, as much as like I've spoken about my concerns about Aaron Rodgers' contract, it's not like Aaron Rodgers is going to go and prevent the Jets from being competitive in the future. It's just an enormous obstacle that you'd be putting there. It's not going to, I want to be very hesitant about the phrase mortgaging the future, because I don't think trading for Aaron Rodgers necessarily would mortgage the Jets' future. I just don't think it's worth it from a cost-benefit analysis. Because really what happens in the NFL, if you study the salary cap, it's not your top guys that you lose. I don't think any of this would put you in danger of lacking the money to re-sign Sauce Gardner or Garrett Wilson in a few years. It's more the guys who are middle of the pack, but these are guys who can really impact your team. The Saints are a good example of a team that's, I don't think, has managed their salary cap very well. And people see them restructuring deals every year, and they say, well, the cap doesn't really matter, but they've lost some good players. I mean, they lost Teron Armstead, they lost Marcus Williams, they've lost Trey Hendrickson. Those are the guys you lose. It's not so much your top-tier guys. You're not going to lose Quinnen Williams, but you lose guys who really can be helpful to your team. So that's the issue if you don't manage your cap well. But doing it for like one or two players is not going to destroy your cap. That's the other thing you have to consider, is that you have to do this to get to a situation where it's materially impacting your team. You have to do this over and over and over. It's not going to be one or two players who do it. So you can always fit in one or two players and not have it really impact your cap situation. It's not something I'm particularly worried about. There are things that concern me about where the direction the Jets are heading in financially. There are things that concern me about the direction the Jets are heading in other aspects. But I think they should be able to afford Quinnen Williams and Derek Carr without materially impacting their ability to field a team this coming season. It's a great question. I understand the concerns. I'm not particularly concerned. I would need to see other overreactions, other poor moves. Next question, John. How much influence do you think Woody Johnson is currently having on the quarterback position? It seems Douglas is simply exploring all the options at quarterback rather than rushing a decision. Do you think Woody is overstepping behind the scenes to get Rodgers, or do you think Douglas is doing his due diligence? Well, I don't think any of us know the answer to that, so I'm not going to guess. My hope is that Douglas is in charge of this. I've said this a number of times over the last couple of weeks. I understand that when the football people have been in charge over the last decade plus, the Jets have not gotten good results. But there's been one scenario that's been worse for the Jets, and that's when Woody Johnson's been making decisions. And I don't know if you caught an interview Woody Johnson gave to Diana Marie Rossini of ESPN at the NFL Awards show right before the Super Bowl. He gave you some football analysis, and listen, I don't know what you think. I was not impressed by Woody's football analysis. I don't think Woody really knows that much about football, or at least he doesn't know enough for a guy who's running a team. I think we'll find out how much Woody's running the team in the weeks ahead. And there's one key thing that's going to tell me this. And the Jets will never tell you this. It'll come out in the media. Eventually these things will leak out. But it's in a scenario where Douglas wants to move forward with Derek Carr, and the Jets lose out on him because Woody's focused on Aaron Rodgers. I'm sure that's going to get out if it happens. My hope, though, is that the football people are allowed to run the team, because say what you will about Joe Douglas, say what you will about Robert Saleh, there's a better chance of the Jets doing good things if they're running the show than if Woody is. But that's what I have my eye on. Are the Jets just going to pass on Derek Carr because they're obsessed with Aaron Rodgers? Because Aaron Rodgers, I don't think there's any question. I mean, not that anybody's explicitly said this, but I don't think there's any question. Aaron Rodgers sounds like the kind of guy Woody would want, because it's, we go back to 2008, Favre all over again, Tebow in 2012. Woody likes to make the big splash. Derek Carr I think it would be a sound move. I don't think it would be the big splash, though. I think, Aaron Rodgers is obviously an iconic quarterback, one of the most legendary players at the position in the history of the NFL. That would be the kind of move I think Woody would like. I'm not saying that Joe Douglas necessarily would rule out Aaron Rodgers, but I think based on what we know about the way Douglas operates, if the Jets do get into a scenario, and again, I'm not expecting this, if the Jets did get into a scenario where they had to give up like a first round pick or multiple first round picks for Rodgers, I would wonder a little bit about whether Woody got involved. I mean, I think there are some pretty telltale signs about the extent to which Woody Johnson's really going to be involved in this team moving forward. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about roster construction. In fact, we're going to talk about how close the Jets are. Are they really just a quarterback away? Well, it depends on what you mean. I'll explain more as we continue this Wednesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, a Wednesday mailbag edition. Our next question. The Jets have some quality talent in Elijah Vera Tucker and Breece Hall if they come back healthy, along with Garrett Wilson, Sauce Gardner, and all the other promising young players. But looking at their core, are we being misled, or is it wishful thinking to believe that the Jets are just a quarterback away? I think it depends on what you think they're a quarterback away from. I think they're a quarterback away from being a playoff team. And I say this with one caveat. I think there's no question that if you put a quality quarterback on this team in 2022, the Jets would have been a playoff team. You cannot assume that everything else stays stable, though, heading into 2023. And I think that's the mistake sometimes you make, is that, some team comes close to the playoffs and they make a couple of additions, and suddenly the fans think, oh, well, if we were that close without this guy, we add this guy, now we're a playoff team. Of course, not everything else stays stable. You get a different schedule. Different injuries can happen. Your opponents, have a role in this. Luck has a role in it. So there's a lot that goes into it. I do think the Jets are a legitimate team that can make the playoffs, though, if they get a stable quarterback in here. Are they a Super Bowl contender? I mean, probably not. I think they're probably in the realm of teams where they can make the playoffs. And if you make the playoffs, you have a shot. You could always be that team that just gets hot at the right time. And we see that from time to time in the NFL, where, a team may not be the best team in the NFL, but they are just the best team in January and February. And they're just, they just play their best football in the playoffs. I mean, they'd be in the mix for that type of thing. And I think with the type of defense the Jets have, I don't think you could ever count them out of a game. I don't think they'd ever go in overmatched. And that's one of the nice things about the 2022 Jets. Lots of frustrating things, especially the way they ended the season. But there were very few games that team was completely overmatched. I mean, there were games they did not play well in, but it's far less than in recent years. Far less than, the last 5-6 years. That team seldom took the field, and you just said they have no shot at competing. This team had a shot at competing. And if you add a quality quarterback to this team, then they'll be in the mix for the playoffs. I don't know if they'll make it. And again, you could have injuries destroy your season. You could just have tough luck with your schedule. But I think that they'll be in the mix. But I don't think they're a Super Bowl team just yet. I think that they're heading in the right direction. And I guess my other thing is, I don't really think that Aaron Rodgers makes them a Super Bowl team. And part of this is I feel like maybe he's showing signs of decline. But I feel like if Aaron Rodgers, in my view, made the Jets a Super Bowl, like a top 3 team in the conference just by adding him, I feel like my view on trading for him would be different. But I just don't think his timeline overlaps with the Jets' timeline. And Rodgers is a guy the next 2 years who you probably, is at the end of his career. So you're probably looking at a 2-year window with him. Whereas I think the Jets' horizon's a little bit longer, where I'm not sure the Jets are going to be there the next 2 years, but they might be there year 3, year 4 if they do what they need to do, if they take care of business in the NFL draft. So that's another factor that I think comes into play. But I don't know that. I don't know if the Jets are a Super Bowl contender. So if that's what you mean when you ask, are the Jets just a quarterback away? The answer would probably be no. But if your question is, can the Jets make the playoffs next year with a quality quarterback? I think the answer is yes. And our last question. Elijah Vera Tucker and Breece Hall were obviously huge parts of the offense. Has there been any significant updates on them? Will they both be ready to hit the ground running week 1? The early reports are yes. It sounds like Breece Hall's told us he's ahead of schedule. Vera Tucker sounds like he's on track to be ready for camp. So things could change, obviously. And I still think you've got to worry a little bit about Breece because, and we've seen the Saquon Barkley's a good example of this, of a guy who was healthy enough to be on the field. I mean, there's no like greater danger of him getting hurt again. But coming back from a knee injury, it's different for every player, and sometimes it takes you, even if you're good enough to play, sometimes it takes a little bit longer for that explosiveness to come back. So the hope is that Breece is going to be the same type of player, and if he is, my goodness, what a difference that will make on the offense. And it's funny because the Jets never really figured out how to connect Breece with Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson played great week 2. Breece was okay. Breece had that 3-week stretch. Garrett Wilson was kind of an afterthought. Breece went down. Garrett Wilson took off. If you can get them both playing at a high level in the same game, it's going to take the offense to a different level. It's going to be a big deal for this team. And Vera Tucker, obviously, the stabilizing force on the offensive line the first half of the season. Jets really missed him in the second half. So hopefully they're both back. All indications are they should be back. They should be ready for the start of the season. Let's hope things stay that way. Now that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please a big thumbs up for this episode. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.